Something happened quietly. No press conference, no dramatic announcement, no leaked audio or explosive interview. Just two players, two separate conversations, and a tone that didn't sound like any offseason update you've ever heard before. Sophie Cunningham didn't just mention she lost weight. She revealed a body transformation so extreme it stopped people mid-scroll. Lexi Hall didn't just talk about the upcoming season. She described a strategic positioning so calculated it felt less like an athlete interview and more like a business manifesto. And underneath both of those moments, one name kept surfacing: Caitlin Clark, not as a teammate, not as a colleague, as a force of nature that had already started reshaping everything around her before she even laced up a single shoe. The way these two women spoke wasn't cautious. It wasn't hopeful. It was certain. And certainty in professional sports is the rarest and most dangerous signal of all. Here's what nobody is talking about. When players of this caliber start making irreversible physical and financial decisions based on one teammate's return, something much larger than a regular season is being built. Cunningham didn't shed nearly 16 pounds of carefully developed athletic mass because she felt good about the offseason. She did it because she understands what's coming and she refuses to be caught on the wrong side of it. Hall didn't quietly align her brand and business strategy with the most watched athlete in women's basketball because she was optimistic. She did it because she sees the tidal wave forming on the horizon. These are calculated moves, cold, strategic, survival-level decisions made by professionals who have read the room with absolute clarity. And if you're not asking what they know that the rest of the world doesn't, you're already behind. Because what's coming isn't a return, it's a detonation. And the fuse has already been lit. Let's be honest about something most sports channels won't say directly. The Indiana Fever are not just a basketball team right now. They are the epicenter of the most significant cultural and competitive shift women's professional sports has ever experienced. Caitlin Clark didn't just enter the WNBA. She fractured its existing order and rebuilt it around a completely different gravitational pull. Arenas that once struggled to sell out are now turning away fans. Broadcasts that once averaged modest numbers are now drawing audiences that rival major network programming. Endorsement money is flowing into the league at a pace nobody predicted, and every single one of those changes traces directly back to one player's presence. But here's the part that should make you lean forward. The players closest to that presence aren't just benefiting from it passively. They are actively engineering their lives around it. And that level of intentionality reveals something the highlight reels will never show you. Because what Cunningham and Hall are doing isn't accidental proximity to greatness. It's a masterclass in reading which direction history is moving and refusing to be left behind. And that's exactly why this video matters right now. Before the season tips off, before the rotation debates explode across every sports platform, before the first transition 3 rattles through the net and the crowd loses its mind, you need to understand the architecture being built underneath the surface. Because by the time the casual fan notices what's happening, the real moves will already be complete. Cunningham's transformation isn't just a fitness story. It's a declaration of intent aimed directly at every coach, every opponent, and every teammate who doubted her adaptability. Hall's strategic positioning isn't just smart networking. It's a fundamental reimagining of what a role player can become inside a generational spotlight. And if you think this is just about who starts and who comes off the bench, you are drastically underestimating the scope of what's unfolding. Stay locked in, because the background of this story is darker, more unstable, and far more fascinating than anyone has admitted yet. To understand what Cunningham and Hall are preparing for, you have to understand the system they're entering. And not just understand it intellectually, you have to feel the weight of what it demands from every single person inside it. Caitlin Clark doesn't run a basketball offense. She runs a controlled detonation. The moment her team secures a rebound, the possession has already begun. There's no walking the ball up. There's no settling into a half-court set. There's no luxury of 3 seconds to assess the floor and find your footing. The decision window opens and closes in a fraction of a second. Wings have to be moving before the pass leaves their hands. Bigs have to be sprinting lanes before the defense even processes the transition. And if one player hesitates, if one rotation is a half step late, the entire geometry of the possession collapses. This isn't an exaggeration. This is the mathematical reality of playing alongside the most dynamic offensive engine in the women's game. And that reality doesn't bend for reputation. It doesn't soften for experience. It exposes everyone equally and without mercy. Last season gave the league its first real preview of what happens when that system activates at partial capacity. Defenses bent in ways that looked almost unnatural. Help rotations that had worked reliably for years suddenly became liabilities. Perimeter coverages that once smothered elite guards left wide-open corners against Clark's gravity. And even with that partial activation, even with the growing pains of a roster still learning the language of her pace, the results were undeniable. Now imagine that same system with one full offseason of intentional preparation behind it. Imagine Cunningham moving 16 pounds lighter through transition lanes that last season she would have reached a step too late. Imagine Hall anticipating passing windows that casual observers haven't even identified yet. Imagine Clark herself returning leaner, sharper, and more aggressive than the version that already rewrote the league's defensive playbook. The system isn't just returning, it's evolving. And the teams that haven't started preparing for that evolution are already in serious trouble. But even that doesn't capture the full danger, because the most unstable element in this entire equation isn't the opponents. It's what's happening inside the locker room itself. There's a version of this story that gets told on the surface. Player loses weight. Player works on her game. Team prepares for star's return. Everyone smiles for the camera and says the right things. That version is clean. It's comfortable, and it completely misses the point, because underneath every calculated offseason move, underneath every carefully worded public statement, there is a layer of pressure so intense that most professional athletes never fully articulate it. When a generational player returns from injury, the roster doesn't just welcome her back, it recalibrates around her. Rotations that felt secure suddenly feel fragile. Minutes that were earned through months of hard work suddenly feel negotiable. Roles that were clearly defined suddenly blur at the edges. And every player in that locker room feels it. Some handle it openly, some handle it privately, and some handle it by making moves so decisive that the uncertainty never gets a chance to take root. Sophie Cunningham chose the third option. And the scale of her physical transformation tells you exactly how seriously she took the threat that uncertainty represented. Think about what it actually means to lose nearly 16 pounds of athletic mass when you're already a professional athlete in peak condition. This isn't a casual fitness journey. This isn't a cleaner diet and a few extra cardio sessions. This is a fundamental restructuring of your physical identity. Cunningham built her entire professional reputation on strength, on physicality, on being the player nobody wanted to body up against in the paint. That version of her worked beautifully in traditional systems. But she looked at the Clark era and made a brutal, honest assessment. The enforcer archetype had an expiration date in this environment, and rather than wait for that expiration to arrive publicly, she burned the old version of herself down deliberately and built something faster in its place. That takes a level of self-awareness that most veterans never reach. It takes courage that the box score will never capture. And it raises a question that should make every analyst uncomfortable. If Cunningham saw the shift coming clearly enough to transform her entire body around it, what does that tell us about the players who didn't make any adjustments at all? Here's where the pressure stops being abstract and starts becoming something you can actually measure. Because the stress building around Indiana's roster isn't coming from one direction. It's converging from every angle simultaneously. From the outside, fan expectations have reached a level that would destabilize most professional franchises. Sold-out arenas create a kind of ambient pressure that players feel in their bones before the opening tip. Every missed rotation gets dissected online within minutes. Every lineup decision becomes a trending debate before the final buzzer sounds. Every slow possession in a Clark-centered offense gets flagged immediately by an audience that has already seen what the system looks like when it's fully unleashed. That external pressure doesn't stay outside the building. It seeps through walls. It shapes practice intensity. It influences the way coaches communicate with players behind closed doors. And when you layer that kind of public scrutiny on top of an already volatile internal recalibration, the psychological weight becomes genuinely extraordinary. Most teams never operate under this kind of microscope. Indiana doesn't have the option to look away from it. But the external pressure is actually the easier half of this equation. The internal pressure is where things get genuinely dangerous. Because inside every locker room, where a generational talent dominates the ecosystem, there are silent negotiations happening constantly. Veterans with established identities quietly measuring their relevance against a new standard. Role players recalibrating their value in real time. Coaches managing egos that can't afford to be visibly bruised under a national spotlight. And new leadership navigating a power structure she inherited rather than built. Stephanie White stepping into this environment isn't just a coaching transition, It's a philosophical stress test with no margin for ambiguity. Every rotation she sets sends a message. Every lineup combination broadcasts her vision for what this team actually is versus what it was comfortable being before. And if that vision doesn't align precisely with the pace that Clark demands, and that Cunningham and Hall have already committed their bodies and businesses to, the fractures won't stay hidden for long. Because pressure at this level doesn't just reveal weakness, it accelerates it. And somewhere inside that locker room, a decision is already forming that will define the entire trajectory of this season before it even begins. Every championship-caliber team reaches a moment where the philosophical direction stops being theoretical and becomes unavoidably real. It stops living in off-season press conferences and training camp soundbites. It lands on the floor in the form of a starting lineup, a rotation decision, a substitution pattern that either confirms the vision or quietly betrays it. For Indiana, that moment is arriving faster than most people realize. And the decision at the center of it isn't complicated when you look at it through pure basketball geometry. But basketball decisions are never made in a vacuum of pure geometry. They're made inside ecosystems of pride, history, expectation, and political weight that no analytics dashboard fully captures. Lexi Hall represents something very specific in this equation. She doesn't dominate possession time. She doesn't manufacture isolation scoring. She doesn't demand the ball in her hands to justify her presence on the floor. What she does is something far more valuable in a Clark-centered system. She makes the entire offense breathe. She spaces correctly before the pass arrives. She contests without gambling. She runs without being told. And in a system built on split-second reads and relentless pace, that kind of selfless precision isn't complementary. It's structural. Remove it, and the whole machine starts grinding in ways that aren't immediately visible, but become brutally apparent over the course of a long season. Here's where the split happens. Traditional coaching instincts don't naturally gravitate toward players like Hall. Traditional instincts reward scorers. They reward veterans with proven production in high-pressure moments. They reward isolation creators who can manufacture points when the shot clock is dying and the crowd is suffocating the building. Hall doesn't fit that profile. She fits a different and arguably more modern profile, the kind of profile that championship teams built around generational engines have learned to value above almost everything else. And that tension between traditional instinct and systemic necessity is exactly where this decision becomes explosive. Because if Stephanie White leans toward comfort, toward established scoring hierarchy, toward the kind of lineup construction that feels safe under pressure, she risks blunting the very weapon that makes Indiana genuinely terrifying to face. But if she commits fully to pace, to spacing, to Hall's brand of quiet surgical efficiency alongside Clark's chaos, she's making a statement that will reverberate through every locker room in the league. She's saying this team has an identity, and that identity doesn't negotiate. And that kind of declaration changes everything about how opponents prepare, how teammates commit, and how the entire season unfolds from the very first possession. The choice is already forming. And the consequences of it will reach much further than anyone in that building is publicly admitting. There's a conversation happening inside the Indiana Fever organization that will never appear in a postgame transcript. It won't surface in a beat reporter's notebook. It won't trend on social media or get debated on a morning sports show. But it is happening. And the evidence of it is scattered across every calculated move these players have made since the offseason began. Because when you strip away the polished media language, when you remove the carefully constructed optimism of training camp soundbites, what you're left with is a group of professionals who have already done the math. They've already run the calculation of what Clark's full acceleration looks like and what it demands from everybody surrounding it. And the results of that calculation aren't comfortable for everyone in that building equally. Some players passed the test before it was even administered. Others are still holding the pencil, hoping the questions don't get any harder. And that invisible divide, that silent separation between those who have fully committed and those who are still quietly negotiating with the reality of this system, is the most dangerous fault line in Indiana's entire championship equation. Here's the layer that makes this genuinely fascinating from a strategic standpoint. The players who have publicly signaled their commitment, Cunningham through physical transformation, Hall through financial and brand alignment, have done something extraordinarily sophisticated. They've removed their own leverage as a negotiating tool and replaced it with something far more powerful: indispensability. When a player restructures their body specifically to thrive in one system, they are telling the coaching staff something that no contract clause can communicate. They are saying, I have already paid the price of admission. I have already done the uncomfortable work. I have already made the irreversible bet. And that kind of demonstrated commitment creates a psychological contract that transcends rotation, debates, and minute allocations. Coaches don't bench players who have visibly sacrificed everything to fit the vision. They protect them. They build around them. They use them as the standard against which every other roster decision gets measured. And that's the move that nobody is crediting Cunningham and Hall for making, because on the surface, it looks like fitness and smart networking. But underneath it is one of the most calculated power plays in recent WNBA history, and there are players in that locker room who haven't made that move yet, which means the clock is ticking loudly for people who don't even realize it's running. Every high-stakes system eventually reaches a threshold where partial commitment becomes indistinguishable from sabotage, where the gap between fully bought in and quietly resistant stops being a philosophical difference and starts showing up in real time on a real floor, in front of a real national audience. Indiana is approaching that threshold faster than the calendar suggests, because Clark's return doesn't come with a grace period. It doesn't arrive with a gentle adjustment curve or a patient developmental timeline. It arrives at full velocity, and the players who haven't completed their internal recalibration before that velocity hits will feel the collision in ways that are impossible to hide under the spotlight this franchise now operates beneath. Think about what a single hesitation looks like in this system. One wing who takes a half second too long to read the outlet pass. One veteran who instinctively pulls up instead of sprinting the lane. One isolation-heavy possession that interrupts the flow of 3 consecutive transition opportunities. Individually, none of those moments look catastrophic, but they compound. They accumulate like small fractures in a structure that's being asked to bear extraordinary weight. And under the compression of a packed arena and a national broadcast, those fractures don't stay microscopic for long. This is the emotional core of everything Cunningham's transformation represents. Because she didn't just change her body, she changed her relationship with fear. The fear of irrelevance. The fear of being the veteran who couldn't adapt. The fear of watching a generational moment unfold from the end of the bench because she refused to pay the price of reinvention. That kind of fear is paralyzing for most professional athletes. It breeds hesitation. It breeds the exact half-committed energy that destroys chemistry in high-speed systems. But Cunningham walked directly into that fear and dismantled it with 16 pounds of deliberate, painful, irreversible action. She made the psychological break before the physical one was even required. And that sequence matters enormously, because players who resolve their internal conflict before the season starts arrive at training camp as stabilizing forces rather than destabilizing one. They don't need reassurance. They don't need their ego managed. They arrive already aligned, already committed, already dangerous. And when Hall made her parallel move in the business and branding space, she completed the same psychological process through a completely different mechanism. 2 players, 2 methods, 1 identical outcome, total commitment with no exit ramp remaining. And somewhere in that locker room, that energy is either spreading or it's being quietly resisted. What happens next will tell you everything about which direction this franchise is truly moving. Let's zoom out far enough to see what this actually looks like from the rest of the league's perspective, because the ripple effect of what Indiana is building doesn't stop at the borders of one franchise's roster decisions. It doesn't stay contained inside one city's arena or one coaching staff's whiteboard. When a team commits fully to a system built around a generational engine, it forces every other organization in the league to confront an uncomfortable question simultaneously. Are we built to compete with this, or are we just hoping it doesn't reach full ignition? And right now, across front offices and coaching staffs throughout the WNBA, that question is being asked with an urgency that the public hasn't fully registered yet, because the teams that faced Indiana last season, even the incomplete, still developing version of this system, already felt the geometry shift beneath their feet. Defensive schemes that had been reliable for years suddenly looked outdated. Switching coverages that neutralized most offenses got stretched to breaking point by Clark's deep-range gravity. Help rotations that were textbook correct got punished because textbook correct assumes a normal pace. And that was before the full optimization. Before Cunningham's lighter frame starts eating up transition lanes a full step faster. Before Hall's surgical spacing starts compressing defensive options from the perimeter. The version that shook the league last season was the rough draft. What's coming is the published manuscript. Here's the financial and cultural dimension that elevates this beyond a purely competitive story. Clark's effect on the WNBA's economic structure isn't gradual. It isn't the slow build of a rising tide that eventually lifts all boats equally. It's a concentrated beam of economic energy that hits the organizations closest to her orbit with disproportionate force. Sponsorship conversations that used to take months now close in weeks when Indiana is involved. Broadcast negotiations that once treated the entire league as a single commodity now increasingly orbit around the question of how many Clark games are included in the package. And the players who understood this early, who positioned themselves inside that economic beam rather than adjacent to it, are operating in a completely different financial universe than their peers on other rosters. Hall's business move wasn't just personally smart. It was a signal to every role player in the league that the old model of waiting for the league's collective bargaining process to slowly improve your financial situation has a competitor now, a faster, more direct, more leverage-rich competitor. And once that signal spreads, once other players across the league start doing the same math Hall did, the entire economic culture of women's professional basketball starts shifting in ways that the league office hasn't fully prepared for. Indiana didn't just change the game on the floor. They may be changing the game around the game. And the shockwaves from that are only beginning to reach the shore. History doesn't announce paradigm shifts politely. It doesn't send a calendar, invitation, or issue a press release. It simply arrives. And the players, coaches, and organizations that recognize the arrival early enough to adapt are the ones history remembers favorably. The ones who didn't adapt get a footnote, sometimes not even that. We've seen this pattern execute with brutal precision before. When Stephen Curry redefined what a basketball offense could look like from the perimeter, it wasn't just the Golden State Warriors who transformed. The entire NBA restructured its roster construction philosophy within 3 seasons. Centers who built careers on post dominance found their minutes evaporating, not because they got worse, but because the game around them evolved past their skill set. Guards who couldn't defend in space became liabilities overnight. Coaches who refused to abandon mid-range heavy systems watched their rosters become strategically obsolete in real time. And the teams that adapted fastest, that rebuilt their identities around the new geometry, rather than clinging to the old one, separated themselves from the competition at a pace that felt almost unfair. That same evolutionary pressure is now bearing down on the WNBA with a force and a speed that mirrors the NBA's transformation almost exactly. And the blueprint Indiana is constructing will either become the standard every competitive franchise chases, or the cautionary tale about what happens when a generational asset gets surrounded by misaligned parts. So let's name the winners and the casualties clearly, because this moment deserves that level of honesty. The winners are the players who read the shift early and made irreversible commitments to the new standard. Cunningham wins because she didn't wait for the system to demand her transformation. She delivered it preemptively, which means she arrives with leverage rather than debt. Hall wins because she understood that proximity to Clark's spotlight was itself an appreciating asset, and she invested in that asset before the market recognized its full value. The coaching staff wins if and only if it has the philosophical courage to commit fully to the identity these players have already built their offseason around. Partial commitment from leadership erases the competitive advantage that total commitment from the roster creates. And that's a devastating irony that has derailed more promising teams than any injury or scheduling quirk ever could. The casualties are harder to name publicly, but easier to identify structurally. Any player whose game depends on deliberate, half-court pace is operating on borrowed time in this system. Any veteran whose value is tied exclusively to isolation scoring will find the Clark era increasingly inhospitable. Any organizational decision-maker who prioritizes comfort over optimization when building around this roster will watch the window close faster than they imagined possible. The blueprint is visible to anyone willing to look directly at it. The only remaining question is who has the courage to follow it without flinching. There's a version of Indiana Fever basketball that exists right now only in the imagination of the people building it. A version where every moving part has been optimized, aligned, and committed to the same relentless identity, where Cunningham's lighter frame is eating up transition lanes before opposing wings have even registered the change of possession, where Hall is already positioned in the corner before Clark's eyes have finished scanning the floor, where the pace doesn't spike in moments of momentum and then recede into comfortable half-court structure, where it stays elevated, sustained, suffocating possession after possession after possession until the defense breaks not from a single spectacular play, but from the accumulated weight of 40 minutes of perfect geometric pressure. That version of Indiana doesn't just win games. It changes how opponents prepare for every game on their schedule. It forces coaching staffs to dedicate practice time specifically to surviving a tempo they have no natural counter for. It forces roster construction decisions to prioritize conditioning and perimeter versatility above almost everything else. It fundamentally reshapes what it means to be a competitive team in this league. And here's the part that should genuinely frighten every front office that hasn't started adapting yet. That version of Indiana isn't a distant hypothetical. It's one fully committed coaching decision away from becoming the present reality. But transformation at this scale always carries a cost. And the cost isn't paid exclusively by the teams on the other side of the floor. It's paid internally too, because building a system this uncompromising requires ruthless prioritization. It requires the organization to make decisions that will feel unfair to players who deserve better outcomes, but simply don't fit the geometric requirements of this particular machine. Veterans with legitimate credentials will see their roles shrink, not because their talent diminished, but because their skill set belongs to an era the franchise is deliberately leaving behind. Role players who thrived in slower systems will find the new pace disorienting in ways that are genuinely difficult to overcome through effort alone. And the emotional weight of those transitions, the quiet conversations in coaches' offices, the gradual reduction in minutes that every professional athlete dreads, that weight is real and it matters. Championship construction has always involved this kind of collateral complexity. The franchises that handle it with clarity and honesty build lasting cultures. The ones that avoid the difficult conversations until they become unavoidable fractures breed the kind of quiet resentment that surfaces at the worst possible moments. Indiana is at that crossroads right now. The new order is being constructed in real time, and the cost of building it correctly is being paid by people whose names won't appear in the championship celebration, but whose sacrifices will have made that celebration possible. That is the uncomfortable truth of every dynasty in the making, and it's arriving in Indiana whether the organization is ready to confront it or not. Go back to the beginning of this story for just a moment. 2 players, 2 conversations. A tone that didn't sound like any offseason update you'd ever heard before. At the time, it felt like interesting news. A fitness transformation here. A smart business move there. 2 athletes saying positive things about their teammates' return in the way professional athletes always say positive things about their teammates returning. But now, you understand what was actually being communicated beneath the surface of those words. It wasn't optimism. It wasn't loyalty. It wasn't the rehearsed positivity of players managing public perception carefully. It was the sound of people who had already seen the future clearly enough to reorganize their entire lives around it. Cunningham didn't lose nearly 16 pounds because she felt optimistic. She lost it because she felt certain. Hall didn't build parallel income streams and align her brand with Clark's gravitational pull because she felt hopeful. She did it because she felt the acceleration coming, and she refused to be standing in the wrong place when it arrived. And that distinction between optimism and certainty is everything. Because optimism hedges. Optimism keeps one foot in the old reality while reaching toward the new one. Certainty burns the bridge behind you. Certainty makes the irreversible commitment before the outcome is guaranteed. And what we witnessed from both of these players this offseason was certainty expressed through action in its most undeniable form. Here is the final truth this entire story has been building toward. Eras don't begin with a single explosive moment that everyone recognizes simultaneously. They begin in the quiet decisions made by people who understood the shift before the crowd did. They begin in an athlete's willingness to restructure her body around a system that hasn't even fully activated yet. They begin in a role player's decision to treat proximity to greatness as an asset worth investing in rather than a threat worth resisting. They begin in a coaching staff's philosophical courage to commit fully to an identity that makes no compromises with comfort or familiarity. And they begin in the accumulated weight of small, irreversible choices that each individually look like preparation, but together constitute a declaration. Indiana's making that declaration right now. Not loudly, not dramatically, but with the kind of structural certainty that the rest of the league should find deeply unsettling. The Clark era isn't approaching. It isn't building momentum somewhere on the horizon. It has already begun, and the only question left is whether you were paying close enough attention to see it before it became undeniable. So here's what we want to know from you right now. Do you believe Indiana has the complete alignment it needs to fully ignite this system? Is Cunningham's transformation the defining move of this offseason? Is Hall the non-negotiable piece that unlocks everything? Drop your most unfiltered take in the comments right now, because this conversation is just getting started. If this breakdown gave you something that the highlight reels never could, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications because we are going deeper than anyone else is willing to go all season long. Share this with every basketball mind you know, because the era has already begun and we are going to document every single moment of it together.